You know, a century ago, Mary Baker Eddy needed no introduction at all. She was one of the most famous women in America. In fact, her contemporary, Mark Twain, said this: "In several ways, she is the most interesting woman that ever lived and the most extraordinary." And Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross, said that Mrs. Eddy should have the respect, admiration, and love of the whole nation, for she is its greatest woman. And yet, the woman herself has kind of just quietly vanished from public thought. Albert Einstein was beginning his career just as Mary Baker Eddy's was ending in the early 20th century. And he said this: "Religion without science is blind, and science without religion is lame." Now, a half century earlier, Mary Baker Eddy had written,
"The two largest words in the vocabulary of human thought are Christian and science. If Christianity is not scientific and science is not of God, then there is no invariable law, and truth becomes an accident."
I wonder what Einstein would have thought about that. This is the journey of a woman who spent a lifetime exploring the deeper dimensions of life and healing. True to her name, Mary Baker Eddy, her life and ideas moved right against the currents of mainstream thought about science, religion, and health. And we're still feeling the ripples of her life and accomplishments a century later. Mary's journey began in the rolling hills of New Hampshire.
This afternoon I saw some little children climbing the hillside, and they reminded me much of my disposition as a child. I was always fond of climbing to the top. No hill was too high for me. I wanted to climb to the top and look over. It has always been this way in spiritual matters also.
She was spiritually inquisitive. This was a characteristic that never left her. As a little girl, she had questions, lots and lots of questions.
I wish I could cut my thinker off.
She was raised in a deeply religious home where the fear of God was drummed into all 6 Baker children by their father, Mark.
My father possessed a strong intellect and an iron will. The family was kept in the tightest harness by Father that I have ever known. The devotions in our home were solemn moments, morning and evening. We had the long prayer and a chapter from the Bible. And the prayer was a long one, often too long for my short little limbs. Nor did it matter how threatening was the storm and how many tons of hay were in the field. Father never permitted the order of these devotions to be altered in any particular.
Now, Mary once found herself unable to sit still during one of Mark's long prayers, and so she
took a long shawl pin from the pincushion on the table.
She crawled along the floor until she got behind where her father was kneeling,
and applied the pin at a point where it brought immediate results.
And in the confusion that followed, made her escape. Now, to his credit, Mark believed that he had a duty to his children to instill the fear of God in them in order to save them from going to hell. Now, Mary was a sensitive girl, and the fear of a punishing God frequently made her ill.
My father's relentless theology emphasized belief in a final judgment day, in the danger of endless punishment, and in a Jehovah merciless towards unbelievers. So perturbed was I by these thoughts aroused by this erroneous doctrine that the family doctor was summoned and I was pronounced stricken with fever. My mother, as she bathed my burning temples, bade me lean on God's love, which would give me rest if I went to Him in prayer as I was wont to do, seeking His guidance. I prayed, and a soft glow of ineffable joy came over me. The fever was gone. I rose and dressed myself in a normal condition of health.
Mary once asked her mother privately if she believed that this doctrine of predestination, that God sent some of His children to hell, was actually true.
She paused, then with a deep sigh answered, "Mary, I suppose it is. What if we repent and tell God that we are sorry and will not do so again? Will God punish us then? Then He is not as good as my mother, and He will find me a hard case.
Even as a young child, Mary was fearless about standing up to injustices whenever she saw them. For example, at school one day, there was an older girl known for her mean streak, and she'd hollowed out an old cucumber and filled it with muddy water, and she was trying to force the younger ones to drink from it.
I can still see her now as she started down the aisle toward the terrified scholars. I could not have been more than 8 years of age, but I planted myself in the aisle down which she was coming and exclaimed, "You shall not touch one of them. I will not permit it." But the girl tossed her head and cried, "Out of my way, or I will knock you over." I folded my arms and I stood my ground with the words, "No, you will not lay a finger on me nor harm one of them." She paused, looked at me, laid the cucumber down, and remarked, "You are a brave little rascal." Throwing her arms around me, she kissed me. Thereafter, whenever she went to impose upon the children, I went to the rescue and prevented her from doing harm until she gave up all attempts to annoy or injure the weaker ones. The teacher confessed to me I had done what whipping had failed to do, for I had changed her character.
Now, Mary was extremely bright. She loved school, but she was often kept at home because of her delicate health. And there was also a popular medical theory at the time, and it said that young women should not use their minds so much because it would draw blood away from their uterus and interfere with childbearing.
My father was taught to believe that my brain was too large for my body, and so kept me much out of school. But I gained book knowledge with far less labor than is usually requisite.
Her love for learning was nurtured by her older brother, Albert, and Albert was really her favorite brother. And when he was home from Dartmouth College, he would tutor her on his college breaks.
Brother and I were like twins. We were interested always in the same things. What he ate, I ate. What he read, I read. He read Shakespeare and the poets, and I pursued them with delight. When he was preparing an address, he would frequently come to me with the question,
"Mary, how does that quotation from Shakespeare read, which begins so-and-so?"
"There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." And without looking in the book, I would give it to him verbatim.
Now, Mary's natural idealism and her faith in a loving God were put to the test as she grew into a young woman. When she was just 20, her favorite brother Albert died suddenly. And then, after just 6 months of marriage, when she was 22, her husband died, leaving her pregnant and penniless. Her fragile health worsened in the next few years, in fact, so much so that she couldn't care for her son, and her son was sent away by her father, Mark Baker. And the family nurse that was taking care of her, that family moved away to the Midwest, and she wouldn't see her son again until he was a grown man.
Everything I loved was taken from me.
Sometimes when we face challenges in our lives, we get angry at God, we question God, or maybe even question God's very existence. For Mary, it was a little different. Her suffering tended to drive her more deeply into her faith. And we get a glimpse of this when she was in her mid-30s. She'd married a man, Daniel Patterson, who'd promised to get her son back, but he proved ineffective. And her health also took a turn for the worse. And life looked pretty bleak at that point.
1857, May 7th, Thursday. I slept very little last night in consequence of memory and wounded feelings. My spine is so weak and inflammatory that the least mental emotion gives me suffering that language cannot depict. Then the debility which follows seems nearly as distressing. Oh, how long must I bear this burden, life?
In the midst of her suffering, Mary did what she'd done all her life. She prayed.
In my extremity, I promised my Heavenly Father that if He would restore me, I would devote my remaining years to helping sick and suffering humanity. As I earnestly studied my New Testament, fresh import was found in the life of the Master. I saw that he not only declared that his works of healing, sickness, and sin should be copied by his followers, but also he expected that his same methods should be employed in helping humanity. Again and again I asked myself, what was the method by which Jesus helped the sick and the sinful?
This became the leading question of her life. How had Jesus healed? Now, this search for answers led her more and more deeply into the Bible, a very natural place for her to turn. But at the same time, she was exploring the alternative healing systems of her time, things like the Graham diet or the water cure, known as hydropathy. And she was also very specifically studying homeopathy and beginning to practice that. That was a new healing system from Europe, and homeopathy used more and more minute doses of drugs instead of more and more drugs. She was doing this not only for her own benefit, but also to help others at the time.
A case of dropsy was given up by the faculty, then it fell into my hands. It was a terrible case. As she lay in her bed, the patient looked like a barrel.
Now, this is known as edema today, and this could be fatal. The woman was suffering terribly, and Mary began treating her with minute doses of drugs, highly diluted with water.
I prescribed the 4th attenuation of argentum nitratum with occasional doses of a high attenuation of sulfurous. She improved perceptibly. Learning that her former physician had prescribed these remedies, I began to fear an aggravation of symptoms from their prolonged use. It then occurred to me to give her unmedicated pellets and watch the result. I did so, and she continued to gain. She went on in this way, taking the unmedicated pellets and receiving occasional visits from me, but employing no other means, and she was cured.
Now, this is known today as the placebo effect. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. She was exploring mind-body medicine, and she was beginning to experience some good results with it. She was also beginning to receive treatment from a man named Phineas Quimby in Maine. And Quimby's treatments initially helped her a great deal, but whenever she was out of his care, his personal care, she relapsed. And so she was learning that while the human mind was an important factor in health, it really couldn't be depended on ultimately for healing. Then in January 1866, when she was 44, Quimby died, and she could no longer turn to him for any support. Her own father had died a few months earlier, severing her ties with his strongly held religious beliefs. And her second husband, Daniel Patterson, well, he was unfaithful to her, and he was not around the night a very serious crisis occurred in her life. A local newspaper carried this account of what had happened. Mrs. Mary M. Patterson of Swampscott fell upon the ice near the corner of Market and Oxford Streets on Thursday evening and was severely injured. She was taken up in an insensible condition and carried into the residence of S.M. Boubier, Esquire, nearby, where she was kindly cared for during the night. Dr. Cushing, who was called, found her injuries to be internal and of a very serious nature, inducing spasms and intense suffering.
The 3rd day was the Sabbath. My clergyman visited me before services, prayed with me, and said farewell.
Her pastor actually didn't think she'd be alive when he returned from church services that day and told her that bluntly.
I requested to be left alone. I opened the Bible to the 3rd chapter of Mark, where our Master healed the withered hand on the Sabbath day. As I read, the change passed over me. The limbs that were immovable, cold, and without feeling warmed. The internal agony ceased. My strength came instantaneously, and I rose from my bed and stood upon my feet well.
Now, many years later, the attending physician claimed to have cured her with his homeopathic remedies. But here's the thing, she wasn't just healed of the effects of this injury. This marked a decisive turning point in her life. She was no longer chronically ill, and she was no longer dependent on others.
I can look back and see that at the time of the accident, although I had no faith in medicine and did not take it, I had faith that God could raise me up.
So was this a kind of faith healing that she had experienced? She felt that something much more was involved.
A dear old lady asked me, "How is it that you are restored to us? Has Christ come again on earth?" "Christ never left," I replied. "Christ is truth, and truth is always here."
She'd caught a glimpse of the truth of how Jesus had healed. And she wanted to know more about it, so she secluded herself for the next few years, trying to figure it all out.
The Bible was my textbook. It answered my questions as to how I was healed. But the scriptures had to me a new meaning, a new tongue. I apprehended for the first time in their spiritual meaning Jesus' teaching and demonstration.
She wrote hundreds of pages of notes during this time on the Bible, and it's incredibly moving to read them in her own hand. You can see her catching glimpses of insight and inspiration and then crossing out whole paragraphs and pages as she's trying to clarify and refine what it is that she's glimpsed.
Step by step, I was reaching by experience and demonstration the scientific proof and the scientific statement of what I had already discovered.
She was living in boarding houses during this time, moving from boarding house to boarding house, and she was aware of people who were suffering and needed help. One of the first was a man with a dangerously infected finger.
The day that his physician had proposed to amputate the finger, I asked to be allowed to treat him. He had his hat on, waiting to take the carriage to visit the surgeon. I said to him, "Will you allow me to stand here a few minutes before you go and think about your finger?"
"If you'll be quick, I will."
I stood in thought for perhaps 5 minutes. When he said,
"There's not a bit of pain or sensation in my finger."
"Take the cloth off and leave it unbandaged." He went out, got in his carriage, and went about his business, never feeling any inconvenience from the finger thereafter.
Now, she healed a neighbor boy of the very same kind of infection, and a journalist later wrote this about this incident. "This strange result made an impression on the family. No one quite knew what to say, and they were about ready to accept the healing of a sore finger as a miracle."
But it is not a miracle, nor would it be if it had been a broken wrist or a withered hand. It is natural, divinely natural. All life rightly understood is so. I was once called to visit a sick man to whom the regular physicians had given 3 doses of croton oil and then had left him to die. Upon my arrival, I found him barely alive and in terrible agony. In 1 hour, he was well, and the next day he attended to his business. I removed the stoppage, healed the enteritis, and neutralized the bad effects of that poisonous oil.
Years later, this is what a newspaper article recounted. Remarkable as was the man's physical healing, even more remarkable was the transformation in his thought and life. His wife told Mrs. Eddy a few days later that she'd never before seen him hug his children as other fathers did. But on the night of his recovery, he called them to him, and taking them in his arms, he told them that he loved them. And with tears rolling down his cheeks, he said to his wife, "I'm going to be a better man." Now, it was this deeper change of thought and character that Eddy knew was at the heart of genuine Christian healing. In a manuscript shared with her students from this period, she wrote,
Question: how can I succeed in doing this so that my demonstration in healing shall be wonderful and immediate? Answer: by being like Jesus. By asking yourself, am I honest? Am I just? Am I merciful? Am I pure?
Now, Christian Science has sometimes been confused with mind over matter or positive thinking, but Eddy saw spiritual healing in an entirely different light.
It is not one mind acting upon another mind. It is Christ come to destroy the power of the flesh. If we would open their prison doors for the sick, we must first learn to bind up the brokenhearted, to be Christ-like, to possess the Christ spirit, to follow the Christ example.
Now, the qualities of tenderness and love and purity and compassion that we associate with the man Jesus, she saw as the healing presence of Christ, the eternal Christ, just as present here, right now, as 2,000 years ago. And living the love of Christ was for her the very essence of healing.
Once I was walking along the street and saw this cripple with one knee drawn up to his chin, the other limb was drawn up the other way up his back. I came up to him and I read on a piece of paper pinned on his shoulder, "Help this poor cripple." I had no money to give him, so I whispered in his ear, "God loves you." And he got up perfectly straight and well. I saw the love of God encircling the universe and man, filling all space. And that divine love so permeated my own consciousness that I loved with Christ-like compassion everything I saw. This realization healed and regenerated and saved all who turned to me for help.
She would often walk in the footsteps of other physicians who maybe have given up on a case or just said that it was hopeless. And she was once called up to Manchester, New Hampshire, where a patient was dying of pneumonia. And the attending physician watched her heal a woman who was had almost passed on from pneumonia. And she healed this woman instantaneously, and he wanted to know how she'd done it.
He asked earnestly if I had a work describing my system of healing.
So in 1872, she began to work on her book, but she faced tremendous obstacles at this time.
I was obliged to move from place to place 8 times the year that I wrote that book, each time taking nothing but my chair and trunk with me. My writing desk was simply a piece of book cover cardboard. There was no good reason for my moving except the antagonism that was felt to the ideas and to me for voicing them.
She actually moved 20 times between 1866 and 1875 when she would publish her book. She was forging radically new ideas in a culture that resisted a woman's voice, and at a time when both medicine and science were trying to reduce everything in life down to material causes and effects. Charles Darwin had recently published his Origin of the Species.
Darwin's theory of evolution from a material basis is more consistent than most theories.
Now, while she respected Darwin's scientific thought, she also differed from him and from other scientists of the time and would challenge them on the basis of their own logic.
Mr. Darwin supports the theory that matter is self-created, that is, evolves itself. Therefore, it follows, if God, Spirit, is a creator, that there are 2 gods. Professor Agassiz brings forward the fact in natural history that one species cannot produce its opposite species, and any partial deviation from this rule is followed by a return to the original species. Therefore, if man was once a monkey, according to Mr. Darwin, he will again be a monkey, according to Professor Agassiz. Theorizing about man's development from mushrooms to monkeys and from monkeys to men amounts to nothing in the right direction and very much in the wrong.
In the pages of her new book, which she titled simply Science and Health, she would write,
"Does God create a material man out of himself, spirit? Nature and revelation inform us that like produces like. Jesus taught but one God, one Spirit, who makes man in the image and likeness of himself, of spirit, not of matter."
In Science and Health, she recast Jesus not as the miracle worker that most people assumed he was, but as
the most scientific man that ever trod the globe. He plunged beneath the material surface of things and found the spiritual cause.
the material surface of things. That sounds a lot like what quantum physicists are saying about matter, that it's not really what it appears to be. In the preface of her book, published in 1875, Mary Baker Eddy announced,
"The time for thinkers has come, and the time for revolutions, ecclesiastic and social, must come."
This revolutionary spirit, who we saw standing up to a bully in school, was now standing up for the spiritual rights of humanity.
"Citizens of the world, gain your freedom. This is your divine right. Sickness, sin, and death belong not to the government of God. Neither are we their helpless slaves.
Eddie believed that no one was predestined to suffer, either because of the belief of a punishing God or the fear of some inherited condition. In the last sentences of her book, she would use a term that became the flagship for the life work ahead of her.
Some readers may wish to tone down the radical points in this work, others to cast them overboard. Yet, truth cannot be lost. If not admitted today in its fullness, future years will point it out and restore at length the fair proportions and radical claims of Christian Science.
Christian Science, the coming together of these two enormous concepts. She believed that both of them were linked to a divine source. And in the pages of her book, she spoke of Jesus' healing practice not as supernatural, but as
supremely natural.
In the next years, Mary Baker Eddy emerged onto the public stage as a dynamic teacher, author, public speaker, and healer. She founded a church and then a college in Boston where she taught her system of healing to others.
The most important thing in the world is to know God and to know what God is.
One of her students, when asked,
"What is God to you?"
replied, "God is love. God is life, truth, spirit. He is all in all. He is destruction."
Now you've said that God is life, truth, love, spirit, all in all, and you've said that He is destruction. Will you tell me how God is destruction? Is there anything but God? What is then there to destroy?
Students came to her classes from all walks of life. They were bankers and businessmen. They were ministers and doctors, housewives and school teachers. And during these 2-week courses, she asked the big questions of them.
What is man? What is intelligence and mind? What is substance?
Her answers opened up a whole new universe to them.
Substance is that which is eternal and incapable of discord and decay. Man is idea, the image of love. He is not physique. Mind is God. There can be but one mind because there is but one God.
A major focus of all her classes was teaching how to heal spiritually. How do you heal instantaneously? Students wanted to know.
Just live love. Be it. Love, love, love. Do not know anything but love. Be all love. There is nothing else. That will do the work. It will heal everything.
As her movement grew and became more visible, she actually decided to move away from the public stage, and she went back up to New Hampshire. She set up residence in Concord.
You know just what I want. Stillness and nature and God.
In these last years of her life, her thought just kept moving outward to the world.
I love the whole human family and have labored to bless all, not a clan, but all. All my work, all my efforts, all my prayers and tears are for humanity and for the spread of peace and love among mankind.
Eddy's rise to fame came during the heyday of yellow journalism in America. And so it's not surprising that her life became the target of some pretty sensational stories over the years. And yet, what actually concerned her most was the effect that the press had on society's health as a whole.
The press unwittingly sends forth many sorrows and diseases among the human family. It does this by giving names to diseases and by printing long descriptions which mirror images of disease distinctly in thought.
her response was to start a newspaper of her own. She called it the Christian Science Monitor. She was 87 years old when she founded it, and she said that the Monitor's mission was
to injure no man, but to bless all mankind.
And this is, I think, a beautiful summary of Mary Baker Eddy's life.
For many years I have prayed daily that there be no more war, no more barbarous slaughtering of our fellow beings. Prayed that all the peoples on earth and the islands of the sea have one God, one mind, love God supremely, and love their neighbor as themselves.
Mark Twain called her the most interesting woman that ever lived and the most extraordinary. She wrote a best-selling book about spirituality and health, founded a college in Boston, and launched a newspaper that's earned 7 Pulitzer Prizes. She just may be the most accomplished and least known woman in the world today. So who is she?